Good morning, friends. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Vitul and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I have been asked to speak on medical emergencies in pregnancy. The pregnant and the postpartum patient, they present a unique set of challenges to the emergency physician. Amongst the challenges, first is the maternal challenges. There is a change in the maternal population. Women are seeking pregnancy at later ages, and with advancements in medicine, they are able to conceive at a later age. Nevertheless, by this age, they develop acquired medical disorders like hypertension, diabetes, obesity. Apart from that, emphasis is needed on training of the medical emergencies in pregnancy, as they require specialized protocols and they require special knowledge about the indicated and the contraindicated drugs. Also, majority of the labor rooms across our country, they are not well equipped to handle these emergencies. So these are the unique set of challenges as far as medical emergencies in pregnancy is concerned. Once you talk about the approach to management, it should ideally begin in the pre-pregnancy time. And all the physicians, they should make it a habit that during their inpatient as well as in the outpatient department, they should counsel the females of the reproductive age group. We need to optimize our medical therapy, and all this management requires a multidisciplinary care, which is very much required. This is clearly a very broad subject, and I would like to provide a snapshot of some of the common medical emergencies which we come across. First and foremost are the hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. Hypertension is the most common medical emergency in pregnancy. In normal pregnancy, blood pressure falls by around 10 millimeters of mercury in the first half of pregnancy and then gradually returns to pre-pregnancy levels by term. It increases the risk of preeclampsia, preterm delivery, fetal growth restriction, placental abruption, as well as perinatal death. If you look into the classification, women, they would have pre-existing hypertension, or they may develop gestational hypertension after 20 weeks of gestation. More so, preeclampsia is a disease which is specific. Preeclampsia is a disease which is specific to pregnancy and can be defined as new onset, or it can occur over chronic hypertension and is associated with significant proteinuria as well as organ dysfunction. It can occur, preeclampsia, it can occur de novo, it can occur over chronic hypertension, and even at times gestational hypertension, they can progress onto preeclampsia. If you look into the complications of preeclampsia, once a patient develops seizures, patient with preeclampsia develops seizures, we call it eclampsia. And the other complications which have been described include the cerebral hemorrhage, pulmonary edema, HELP syndrome, which is hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, low platelet. There is placental abruption. There could be fetal distress as well as growth restriction. And there could be acute kidney injury and DIC. Management of these patients is concerned. Patients with preeclampsia require hospital admission for close monitoring. And delivery remains as the definitive management, which may be required urgently in severe cases. The other factors which are required is control of blood pressure and the prevention of convulsions. As far as management of blood pressure is concerned, it has been a common practice to maintain a target blood pressure of 150 by 100. But there have been theoretical concerns regarding that lower targets, they may compromise the uteroplacental circulation and hence affect the fetal growth. Nevertheless, one of the latest trials, which has been the CHIPS trial, it has shown that neonatal outcomes are no different once the target blood pressure of diastolic is lowered to 81 to 85 millimeters of mercury. Hence, when treating blood pressure in pregnancy, the aim should be tight control with target diastolic blood pressure of 81 to 85 millimeters of mercury. As far as pharmacological management is concerned, the first choice is labetalol, which is a non-selective alpha and a beta blocker, and it is preferred medicine when the pulse rate is more than 100 millimeters, 100 per minute. Then, as far as the alternative first line is concerned, it is nifedipine, which is modified release, especially when the pulse rate is less than 100 millimeters, 100 per minute. The second line drugs are methyl-dopa and amlodipine. The third line is daxoxyzine, hydralazine, and the selective beta blockers. The drugs which are absolutely contraindicated in pregnancy include the ACE inhibitors, the angiotensin II receptor antagonists, as well as the diuretics, especially the spironolactone. The ACE inhibitors, they have to be avoided in acute kidney injury. Enalapril and captopril are the preferred agents as far as safety data is concerned regarding the postpartum period, but preferably they should be avoided. Another point which I would like to mention here specifically is that nifedipine should not be given as a sublingual dose. It should be never administered sublingually. For rapid control, the same line of drugs, nifedipine, labetalol, hydralazine, and nicardipine are there. Nifedipine is contraindicated if there is presence of congestive cardiac failure or AV and SA nodal abnormalities. Labetalol is contraindicated if there is asthma, there is diabetes, there is presence of bradycardia, as well as in congestive cardiac failure. So the line of management remains the same drugs, but we need to see how frequently we need to administer and how frequently we need to increase the dose and titrate the dose for rapid control of blood pressure in these patients. For seizure control and prevention, it is the magnesium sulfate which is recommended in all cases. An IV loading dose of 4 to 6 grams is usually followed by a maintenance infusion of 2 grams per hour, but we need to monitor for signs of magnesium toxicity. As far as seizure control is concerned, again, it is the IV loading dose as well as the intermittent IM injections which are there, but we should ensure that there is no evidence of magnesium toxicity, the patellar reflux is present, respiration is not depressed, and urine output in the previous 4 hours has exceeded 100 ml. The delivery decision remains the obstetrician's decision, but for us, we need to know that cesarean section is done as per the obstetric indications only. It is not that for every patient with preeclampsia, we need to do cesarean section. So the indication delivery decision remains as the obstetrician's decision, and LSCS is as per the obstetric indications. Going on to next one, common peripartum cardiomyopathy. 2010 Heart Failure Association of the European Society of Cardiology Working Group, this defined as peripartum cardiomyopathy as an idiopathic cardiomyopathy presenting with heart failure secondary to LV systolic dysfunction. Mind you, it is LV systolic dysfunction towards the end of pregnancy or in the months following delivery where no other cause of heart failure is found. It is a rare disease, but the incidence varies along with the region. It can vary between 1 to 300 to 1 to 4,000 pregnancies. The etiology remains unknown, but there is incidence increases with increasing age, multiparity, family history, ethnicity, especially the Africans, smoking, diabetes, hypertension, and preeclampsia. They are all the risk factors associated with peripartum cardiomyopathy. So clinical presentation is similar to LV systolic dysfunction. The early signs and symptoms could be mistaken for physiological changes of pregnancy, but the clinical symptomatology remains the same. So the diagnostic criteria indicates that it is the ejection fraction, which is less than 45%, and there may not be any ventricular dilatation. So remember two things. It is the LV systolic dysfunction. It is an idiopathic cardiomyopathy, and it is occurring in the end of pregnancy as well as in the months following delivery. The treatment remains the same as in the non-pregnant patients. There is bed rest, sodium restriction, digoxin, diuretic treatment. Anticoagulants are indicated when there is massively enlarged cardiac chambers so as to prevent the risk of pulmonary thromboembolism. ACE inhibitors should be avoided because of the risk of teratogenicity, and prognosis is usually good in peripartum cardiomyopathy with higher rates of recovery than other forms of heart failure with decreased EF. And this recovery usually occurs within 3 to 6 months. Another important is acute myocardial infarction. It is rare, but pregnancy increases the risk of AMI by 3 times. It is common in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, but more common in the puerperium period, 6 weeks after delivery. Again, it has been found that the risk factors are the advanced maternal age, multiparity, twin pregnancy, Afro-Americans, and some of the other metabolic factors, diabetes, dyslipidemia, high BMI, some diseases like SLE. So these are all the risk factors which are associated. Although atherosclerosis remains as a cause for majority of the patients with acute MI, but I would like you to remember that spontaneous coronary artery dissection has been found to be the main cause of MI in the peripartum period. So this is one entity which one should be aware of. Labor and delivery, the standard cardiac care, we have to avoid elective delivery within 2 weeks of infarction. So these are common cardiovascular emergencies which can occur in a patient with pregnancy. Going on to the pulmonary complications, venous thromboembolism and pulmonary embolism, bronchial asthma, these are the main things. So one should know that pregnancy and the postpartum state, it fulfills all the 3 criteria of the Virchow's triad, which includes the venous stasis, the hypercoagulable state, and the vascular damage. Pregnancy increases the risk of venous thromboembolism and embolism 4 to 5 times as compared to the non-pregnant women. And pregnancy is more associated with DVT than pregnancy associated with pulmonary embolism. More commonly, I would like to ask you to remember that 85% of the times it occurs on the left side. It is more marked on the left side because of compression of the left iliac vein by the right iliac artery as well as the ovarian artery. And 70% of them are iliofemoral and they have a higher risk of thromboembolism. The risk factor, again, is increasing gestation, and emergency LSCS has also been said to be a risk factor for venous thromboembolism, and certain other medical and obstetric factors have been found. We should remember that the sensitivity of D-dimer as a test for venous thromboembolism is low. The pre-test probability well score is also not very well documented or validated in pregnancy. So the most important thing is the thorough history and examination. We always try to, avoid doing a chest X-ray, but remember, chest X-ray should always be performed first. There is a negligible radiation risk as pneumonia and pneumothorax can present similarly. If pulmonary embolism is still suspected, then a nuclear medicine perfusion scan or a CTPA, that is a computerized tomography pulmonary angiogram, should be performed. And investigation should not be withheld simply because the patient is pregnant. And remember that the maternal and the perinatal risks of missing a diagnosis of venous thromboembolism are thought to be greater than the risk associated with investigations. As far as treatment is concerned, treatment dose, the low molecular weight heparin should be commenced immediately and continued if the diagnosis is confirmed. The doses required are higher than in the non-pregnant patients and are listed in the RCOG guidelines. Unfractionated heparin is also safe but is associated with thrombocytopenia, and it should be reserved with mothers with renal dysfunction or if delivery is imminent and the need for reversal is anticipated. Warfarin and the other direct oral anticoagulants such as rivaroxaban should be avoided in pregnancy, and pregnancy is not a contraindication to thrombolysis, which can be considered in massive life-threatening pulmonary embolism. Bronchial asthma, the acute exacerbation, it occurs in 1/3. In 1/3, the situation remains better, and in 1/3, there is no change during pregnancy. The adverse fetal outcomes, they include preterm birth and infants of small for gestational age. The management of status asthmaticus is similar to the non-pregnant, except one should be careful that mild hypoxemia should be treated aggressively because it is detrimental to the fetus, and an arterial blood gas PaCO2 of more than 35 during status asthmaticus, it implies that there is impending ventilatory failure. If you look into the abdominal causes, acute abdominal pain, the major etiologies could be obstetric and the non-obstetric causes. Amongst the non-obstetric causes, acute appendicitis remains the commonest, followed by cholecystitis, pancreatitis, and the small gut obstruction. The diagnostic approach remains tricky because of the altered clinical presentation due to the anatomical and the physiological changes of gestation, and also the reluctance to radiological investigations. Acute appendicitis, as I said, is the commonest. It most commonly occurs in the second trimester of pregnancy, whereas perforation has been seen to be more common in the third trimester of the pregnancy. The clinical presentation may be ambiguous, especially in the third trimester because of the anatomical and the physiological changes. Leukocytosis is physiological in cases of pregnancy, but remember, if there is a shift towards the left and if there are band forms, it suggests inflammation. Ultrasound abdomen remains the first line of treatment for investigation. MRI is the second, followed by MRI. MRI is less reliable if there is presence of extraluminal air. Surgery remains the treatment of choice. Antibiotics in uncomplicated appendicitis have been used to control the appendicitis. So if we have to go in for investigations, ultrasound the first, and MRI, which is less reliable if there is presence of extraluminal air, is the second line of investigation in these cases. Endocrinological, diabetic ketoacidosis, and thyroid storm. Diabetic ketoacidosis is a life-threatening metabolic complication. It occurs in 1% of the diabetic pregnancies. Sorry for the slide here. Can occur with type 1, type 2, as well as gestational diabetes. The risk factors are because of hyperemesis gravidarum, beta mimetic drugs, especially the tocolytic drugs, infections, corticosteroids given to induce the fetal lung maturation. So these are all the risk factors which can precipitate diabetic ketoacidosis. And what is different in pregnancy? It occurs at lower blood glucose level. It can present more rapidly than in the non-pregnant women. Insulin resistance is, especially in the second and third trimester, is common. There is accelerated starvation in these patients. Nausea and vomiting are more common in pregnancy. And because of the reduced renal buffering of acid, pregnancy is a state of compensated respiratory alkalosis. So diabetic ketoacidosis occurs at lower levels and it occurs at an earlier level. As far as management is concerned, we all know that management remains the same. Aggressive fluid resuscitation is important. When do we need to give insulin and when do we monitor for the monitoring and replacement of electrolytes is same as in non-pregnant women. But we need to continuously do fetal monitoring in these cases. It has been seen that non-reactive traces are common. Repetitive late decelerations are easily seen. Non-reassuring profile during the fetal monitoring is seen. And these all indicate fetal compromise, but remember, they may reverse as metabolic insult is reversed. So we should not lead to this. These all readings should not lead to rush for LSCS. The latter should be reserved for prolonged bradycardia, but which does not resolve with maternal resuscitation. We need to discuss with the antenatal diabetes consultants. And incidence, remember, of fetal loss can be as high as 20% with DKA. The treatment line remains the same: continuous fetal monitoring and persistent bradycardia, which does not reverse with the metabolic reversion in the mothers. It should be an indication for LSCS. Otherwise, we should not rush for LSCS in these patients. Second, thyroid storm. It usually presents with systolic hypertension. There is wide pulse pressure. There is tachycardia. There is hyperthermia, diaphoresis, tremor, nausea, vomiting. So propyl thiouracil should be started immediately at a dose of 1 gram orally. If the patient is unable to swallow, NG should be used in these cases. Once the diagnosis is confirmed, the loading dose has to be followed by 200 milligram of propylthiouracil every 6 hourly. 1 hour after PTU is administered, iodide is administered. It could be given as potassium iodide or Lugol's iodine. Even IV sodium iodide is another option. Dexamethasone should decrease the thyroid hormone production and secretion. Hypertension and tachycardia we need to manage with beta blockers. So this is how we need to be aware of these endocrinological emergencies, and we need to manage these accordingly. Another important thing, emergency, what we come across is epilepsy. It is a high-risk emergency. Maternal mortality increases 10-folds if it is poorly controlled, especially in the pre-pregnancy period. And that is the need for counseling, pre-pregnancy counseling, which is important in these patients. And how does this poorly controlled epilepsy occur? There is because of the discontinuation of the anti-epileptic medicine, there is fall in the drug levels. Fall in the drug levels can occur because of increased blood volume. It can occur because of the nausea and vomiting, and especially the poor compliance. People are not aware and they tend to miss on these medicines, or they're afraid that continuation of these medicines may affect the fetus. Hence, it is important to see that these factors do not occur. The role of therapeutic drug monitoring becomes very important. Lamotrigine may require significant dose increases. There is increased risk of obstetric hemorrhage, hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, and IUGR in patients who have epilepsy during pregnancy. Remember that all of these drugs, they are having teratogenic effects, but we have to look at the benefits versus the side effects of these drugs. The pharmacokinetic considerations have to be given, and the teratogenic effects have to be looked into. As I mentioned, therapeutic drug monitoring becomes important in patients with pregnancy and epilepsy. The dose of lamotrigine, they need to be increased 2 to 3-fold. And it has to be, drug levels and dose adjustment is recommended only if there is a increase in the seizure frequency. Some of the systemic inflammatory and the autoimmune conditions such as SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, and IBD, they occur in females of childbearing age. Good disease control improves the fertility, improves the maternal health, and the fetal and the neonatal outcomes. The most important, good disease control is obvious benefit is there. So most important thing is to ensure the compliance to medication. A major source of uncertainty for patients as well as the healthcare professionals relates to the safe use of medications during pregnancy. So, but remember, there is growing evidence of drug safety in pregnancy, and it is important, or it is vital, to avoid cessation of these important medications because of theoretical as well as the unwarranted concerns. Remember that prednisolone and methylprednisolone, they are extensively metabolized by the placenta, and less than 10% reaches the fetus. Prednisolone should be used in preference to the fluorinated steroids such as dexamethasone, as the latter crosses the placenta to a higher degree. There is great data of safety on the use of hydroxychloroquine, sulfasalazine, mesalazine, as well as azathioprine. There is enough safety data on the use of cyclosporin and tacrolimus. As far as biologicals are concerned, they can be used safely in early pregnancy they do not cross the placenta up to 16 weeks of gestation. And to minimize the neonatal levels of these drugs at birth, these drugs should be discontinued if possible by 20 weeks if we are using infliximab, and by 28 weeks if you are using adalimumab and etanercept. Some of the drugs which should be avoided in all stages of pregnancy include methotrexate, leflunomide, mycophenolate, and cyclophosphamide because of its concerns for teratogenicity. So the uncertainties regarding these medicines should be cleared, and theoretical as well as these unwarranted concerns we should not stop the medicines and hence exacerbate the disease and cause poor neonatal and fetal outcomes. One of the most important cause of maternal morbidity and mortality is sepsis. Maternal mortality rates, if you see, they are very high in Asia and Africa, that is the low income areas as compared to the high income areas. But remember that maternal deaths from sepsis are largely preventable. Early detection and treatment can improve our outcomes as well as our survival. If you look at causes of sepsis in obstetrics, obstetric causes and the non-obstetric causes, amongst the obstetric causes, it is mainly septic abortions, premature rupture of the membranes, chorioamnionitis, postpartum endometritis, wound sepsis, be it the episiotomy sutures or be it the cesarean sutures, retained products. So these are the common causes. And if you see, 50% of the maternal deaths due to sepsis are related to septic illegal induced abortion or the septic abortions which are occurring in our country. And sepsis and septic shock, they can all be caused because of these things. And what are the risk factors which are there for sepsis? Obesity, diabetes, or the impaired glucose tolerance, impaired immunity, anemia, vaginal discharge, history of pelvic infection, history of group B streptococcal infections. These are all common causes, the risk factors, which increases the chances of sepsis and maternal mortality. As far as the effects of pregnancy, the normal physiological aspects of pregnancy and the physiological changes which are occurring in relation to sepsis, what is the cumulative effect? It causes rapid hemodynamic collapse as far as the cardiovascular system is concerned. There is susceptibility to pulmonary edema. There is rapid decrease in oxygenation and there is respiratory failure. It causes acute kidney injury and it causes DIC. So pregnancy plus sepsis, all these, it is the cumulative effect: cardiovascular, respiratory, renal, coagulation. And if you look into the organisms, it is the polymicrobial infections. The prevalence in pregnancy, the gram-negative rods is the highest. Apart from that, Staph aureus gas, also known as the Streptococcus pyogenes, all these organisms are the major causes of pathogen. We need to see that administration of IV broad spectrum antibiotics within 1 hour of suspicion of severe sepsis, with or without septic shock, is recommended as part of the surviving sepsis resuscitation care bundle. A combination of piperacin, tazobactam, or a carbapenem plus clindamycin provides one of the broadest ranges of treatment for severe sepsis. MRSA could be resistant to clindamycin. Hence, if the woman is or is highly likely to be MRSA positive, a glycopeptide such as Vanco or teicoplanin may be added if the sensitivity is known. Surgery needed in addition to antibiotics. Yes, we need to drain out if there is a collection of pus. Other treatments which are required and which need to be monitored very closely includes the glucose control. It has to be less than 180 milligram per deciliter. Gastric stress ulcer prophylaxis, PPIs, could be used. DVT prophylaxis is important. Remember, there is a less role of steroids and activated protein C. These are important things which we need to know as far as management of sepsis is concerned. NSAIDs should be avoided for pain relief in cases of sepsis, as they impede the ability of polymorphs to fight the gas infection. Epidural and the spinal anesthesia should be avoided in women with sepsis, and general anesthetic will usually be required for cesarean section. So although it is a very vast subject and one can just go on and on, I know that I'm running short of time. So in conclusion, I would like to say that although there is an overall decrease in the maternal mortality rate, but it is not decreasing as far as the treatable medical conditions is concerned. And majority of this data is from the Western population. We need to improve the training. We need to emphasize on preconception counseling in all women attending our inpatients and outpatients in women who are in the reproductive age group. We need to promptly recognize the acute illness and optimally manage these. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and patience.